Hello, my I Can Relate family, and welcome back to season 4, episode 2, Surviving a Terrorist Attack. Today, we sit down with Travis, who shares his story of surviving the Westminster terrorist attack in 2017, where 5 people were killed and 50 were injured. He was hit head on by the car and went flying and suffered a lot of damage to his body. And he shares with us how these 82 seconds changed the trajectory of his life. I wanted to do this episode because I live in London, and it really was when I had first moved here that attack happened. And growing up, in Bermuda in a small town, I was so unfamiliar with the idea of a terrorist attack. It was always something I'd just seen on TV. So I wanted to get the perspective of someone who's actually survived a terrorist attack. What was that like? What kind of traumas have you experienced? And are you scared to live in a city? What coping mechanisms do you have? Travis is so open with his story. So I do hope that you get something out of this.
Hi, Jess.
Hello, Travis. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you.
So where are you dialing in from today?
I'm dialing in from Lancashire, which is in the northwest of England.
Nice. Were you born and raised there?
I was, yeah, so not too far from home. What about yourself?
Dialing in from London. I've been
Yeah.
in England for 10 years, but I was born and raised in Bermuda.
Mhm. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So how old are you now, Travis? Because I know the attack happened when you were 19.
Yeah, so I'm 24 now.
24. Okay. I mean, I could have done the math on that myself, to be honest, with knowing it was 2017. Before we jump into your story, I wanted to cast your mind back. You were 19 years old. Would you tell us a little bit about what life was like for you then, painting us a scene of who you were?
Sure. Well, I was in my first year of university at the time. Um, I had started university, obviously, at September the year before. And I think we just really sort of got to the point where we actually start paying attention in that first year. Uh, where you've got past the sort of the freshers and the the sort of first few months where you're not really paying attention. And actually, we were getting towards the exam series, and towards the end of the year, and we had lots of deadlines piling up, so it was starting to get a bit more serious. And I think this sort of trip down to London was our last proper chance at a bit of a social. I know it was a university trip, and we did have some sort of studying alongside it. But it was also a chance, with your mates to go down to London and grab a few beers and everything and sort of relax before we got into that exam period.
Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind, would you share what that day was like for you?
Sure, sure. We had lots of meetings planned in and around Parliament. Obviously, it was all very politics focused, given that was the start of the course that we were down there with. And we headed over to Parliament first thing. We had a tour of Parliament, and then we met with a few MPs, sort of MP staffers, and we also had lunch with a member of the House of Lords. And after the lunch, we headed back to Parliament because we had a meeting with our local MP. Um, and she had to run off, so we were left with half an hour of free time. And I always sort of emphasize that you don't really put much thought to it at the time, because you would never sort of anticipate that something like this would happen to you. And so we all split off into smaller groups. At the end of the day, we only had half an hour, so it wasn't enough time to sort of go out sightseeing. So one group, for example, stayed in the House of Commons cafe, just grabbed a cup of coffee, and we'll wait until the next meeting. Another group went off to do a bit of shopping, I believe. And then myself and about 4 of the lads just decided to get some fresh air. To be quite honest with you, we're probably a little bit hungover from the night before anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and so we left Parliament and took a right and started walking along Westminster Bridge. And we got about, I think, a third of the way along the bridge before the attack, commenced. I'd actually taken a picture of Big Ben on the way out and I'd sent it on Snapchat. So I was chatting to a friend about it. And it was only when one of the other lads in the group shouted "cow" that I looked up from my phone and obviously saw the car coming towards me. I didn't have enough time to react, and to be quite frank, that's probably what saved me. And the terrorist was driving a 4x4 vehicle. It was, you know, an SUV, and he'd mounted the pavement at the other end of the bridge, and started hitting pedestrians, myself and my friends included. And when he got to us, you know, we were towards the end of the bridge actually, so he'd already hit several people. Um, we were all hit by the car. Now, fortunately, we were all incredibly lucky to survive, um, but our injuries were all dependent on where we were stood on the pavement. So because I was closest to the road, I ended up being hit head on by the car. Essentially, I went over the bonnet, you know, onto the windscreen, and then was thrown into the air. Whereas the rest of the lads in my group sort of got glancing blows. One of them was hit by the wing mirror, another by the wheel axle, and then another was essentially winded by the bumper that flew off in midair. But as I say, I was thrown over the bonnet and landed back down the concrete. And that moment when I landed back down the concrete was incredibly lucky, incredibly fortunate, because the other lad that had been hit by the side mirror was already on the floor, and as I landed back down the concrete, my head actually landed on his stomach and was cushioned.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
Whereas everything else on the left side of my body, which I landed on, that hit the concrete, was fractured. And the doctors were pretty, you know, pretty honest with me that you know, was a sort of watershed moment, if you will. And if my head had hit the concrete, it would have been game over. And because my head had landed on my friend's stomach and it had cushioned the blow, I didn't actually lose consciousness. And immediately after, I got up, unaware of the, you know, the injuries I'd sustained, whether that's shock, whether that's adrenaline. I remember this bizarre feeling that you know, I knew I had to collect my phone because that had been in my hand at the time when the car had hit me. And bizarrely, my shoes had flown off when the car had hit me because of the force it had hit me with. And I knew, just sort of perhaps in autopilot in my head, I had to get my shoes as well. And so in the process of doing that, you know, I walked the full length of the bridge, saw the range of injuries and fatalities that had been sustained, collected my shoes and my phone, and that was when we noticed that one of the other lads in our group was actually missing. We didn't know where at this point, and obviously you fear the worst in something like this. And people were shouting that someone had gone over into the Thames. So we were looking over the side of the bridge and trying to find him as well. Unfortunately, we couldn't find him at the time. Luckily, he had survived, and you know, in shock, he'd left the bridge, and was found several hours later. But of course, we didn't know that at the time. So there was that to deal with, in addition to our own, you know, personal injuries. It felt like, you know, it felt like forever that we were on that bridge waiting for the emergency services to arrive, but it really was only seconds. But I think in the shock of, you know, of everything that's going on, you lose track of time. And I returned to the other lads in my group. One of them, I think, was panicking because he had quite a bad gash on his forehead and the blood was running into his eyes. So we tried to essentially suppress the bleeding. One of the other lads had a pack of tissues and was putting that on his head. And it was about, I think, probably about 10-15 minutes later that I guess the adrenaline that I was experiencing started to run out. By this point, it was obvious that the attack was over, or at least the initial stage of the attack. Of course, you don't know during one of these events if there's just one person involved. And after I'd collected my phone on the floor, I rang some of the other people that were still in Parliament, though, of course, you know, trying to explain what had happened over the phone and trying to warn them. It's almost as if they, you know, probably thought it was a joke, because
Yeah.
you'd never think that something like that would happen. But it was within seconds of the car hitting us that the terrorist had crashed, had got out on foot, and after stabbing a police officer, had been shot dead. And of course, you hear the shots ring out, and you know that you know, it's at the very least, under control in that moment. And it was about 10-15 minutes afterwards that the adrenaline had started to run out, and felt this sort of rush of blood to my head. And I knew I had to sit down. So I sat myself down on the bridge against the parapet. And gradually paramedics began to arrive. Again, unaware of the injuries I sustained, we kept sending them on to other people. Knew something was wrong, but at the end of the day, we just felt can't be that serious if we're here talking and walking. And soon enough, the other lads were walked off the bridge as walking wounded to a nearby hospital. For those that aren't aware, there's a hospital literally the other side of the bridge, which obviously is very fortunate for an incident like this. And they were walked off as walking wounded, but it became clear that I couldn't walk. I couldn't get back up off the floor. And so I had to wait for a stretcher to take me to the trauma centre. Now, in this time, I don't remember this at the time, but having seen the footage and the evidence afterwards, it's evidently clear. But I started to lose a lot of blood. I didn't know about this until they discovered it, but I had quite a bad, what they called a shrapnel wound, although obviously not shrapnel in the explosive sense, but shrapnel in the sense of the pieces that had come off the car. I had quite a bad shrapnel wound at the top of the left leg. And unaware, at the time that I was bleeding, started to go a bit grey in the face, and starting to not necessarily lose consciousness, but lose strength of mind. And they soon came over, checked the wound. Very fortunately, it was mere centimeters away from the artery, but hadn't nicked the artery, which was the thing that they were obviously worried about. But soon after that was discovered, they got me on a stretcher, and I was at King's College Hospital within, I think, about 30 minutes after the attack. And as soon as I arrived, they completely took over. They'd set up a trauma centre. They had a lot of training in this sort of area. They were, I think, the designated trauma centre actually for London itself for any sort of emergency. And I was wheeled straight in into a ward with probably about 10 other victims there. But it was a wide open space where everyone had, every one of these victims had about 10 nurses and doctors, dealing with them personally as well. So it was by no means understaffed. And yeah, we arrived and they pretty much said, just lay there and let us do our job. And for the next few hours, I was in and out of scans, MRIs, CT, as they tried to work out the range of injuries I'd sustained. There was a worry that I'd sustained a hip injury, because when I was sat down, I was complaining of pain at the lower back, but fortunately that was just from soft tissue injury. And it wasn't the reason why I couldn't walk, which we later found out was injuries to the leg. And after having the scans done, I was taken for my first operation, which was only under local anaesthetic, but was probably the most painful thing I've experienced in my life, actually. And that was on my hand. Now, what had happened to my left hand was that in being hit by the car and landing back down on the concrete, I'd fractured every single finger in the left hand and the hand itself, apart from the thumb. And every single finger was, to be quite crude about it, was twisted and pointing in a different direction. Some were bent back, some were, to the side. It was essentially mangled, the hand. And as you can see, I've fortunately made a full recovery. They had to, manipulate and reset every single finger on what was a broken hand. So it was incredibly painful, and, no amount of local anesthetic will numb that down. But after they'd reset the fingers, they were able to put my hand and the arm in a cast. And then I was finally transferred to a ward at around, I think it was midnight. And then at around 5 or 6 in the morning the following day, I was taken to the ward where I would stay for the next, roughly next 7 days it was. I had 8 days in hospital in total. And on the third day, I guess, just to sort of fast forward a little bit, on the third day in hospital, I had an operation on my left leg. They discovered 2 fractures there. Both were internal. There were no protruding bones. One was a minor fracture, which could have easily been fixed by putting it in a cast, but they couldn't put it in a cast because the other fracture was to my, I believe they call it the ACL. It's a very common sports injury, which is on the ligament, the torn ligament on the leg, and they had to operate on that and put metal work in. So of course they couldn't put my leg in a cast until they'd actually put that metal work in. And I guess just to sort of bring things full circle, that same day actually that I had the operation, I was visited in hospital by Prince Charles, which was, you know, an incredible surprise, and was you know, if nothing else, a positive in what was, you know, a horrific experience.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, Especially as, of course, you know, London to me was an alien city. It was a city that I hadn't necessarily been to. I think I'd been once before when I was in year 6 at primary school. And it, you know, I didn't have family around until they were able to get down to London to be with me. So as bizarre as it sounds, having Prince Charles there was in many ways a familiar face. I don't know if that's
Mm.
understandable, but that's certainly the way that I saw it at the time, and it was very reassuring. And I was discharged after 8 days, and then essentially spent the next 6 months on a walking stick and crutches until I could begin to walk again. In total, it took 2 years of physiotherapy, but I was able to make a full recovery, which I think is
Wow.
pretty miraculous given the circumstances.
Yeah. Wow. How long did it take for your family to join you in the hospital?
So my mum was down, I believe, either on the second or third day after the attack,
Yeah.
uh, and I had 2 friends actually that lived in London, because again, didn't know many people in London, and might not come as a surprise, but there's not many people from rural Lancashire that do tend to move to London, so it's a small bunch. But fortunately, I was able to text them and as well and say, you know, could you bring me some clothes, for example, because whilst I was on the bridge, you know, the police and the paramedics had cut away all my clothes. So all I had was, and obviously I'd taken them as evidence as well. So all I had was, you know, was what the hospital had given me. But they were able to bring me clothes and, you know, come and visit me as well, which was a really big, I think, important, you know, thing to have someone to tell the story to, really. Not in a macabre way necessarily, but just to sort of get it off your chest. I think when you're going through, you know, a traumatic incident like that, there's a lot of things you can forget as well, or sort of involuntarily, you know, block out. And I think it's important to get it out and tell someone about this, so that you are able to refer back to it later.
Yeah, absolutely. And when your phone went flying, did it break or were you able to? I know you said you were texting friends, so you were able to communicate with people still.
Yeah, so the bizarre thing is, I mean, these iPhones, you drop them and they break, but you know, I got hit by a car and it was perfectly, not a single scratch on it.
Oh my God, it's so true. It honestly, that's amazing. Do you remember when you called your parents and told them about it? How did they find out?
Yeah, so it was, you know, it wasn't necessarily a priority for me, instinctively to ring them when I was on the bridge. Of course, I rang the guys who were in Parliament, because you know there was a threat. This was coming their way, um, and I certainly didn't ring the police actually, because you know literally everyone around me was on their phones,
Yeah.
and you know quite frankly, when my left hand looked the way it did, there were more pressing things to do,
Yeah.
than try ringing the police.
Yeah.
Um, but as soon as the police arrived, actually, there was a police officer who I sort of referred to as my first responder, because, of course, all the others we you know passed on to other people and said, no, there's more people who are worse injured. He said, you know, is there a loved one I can ring? And this was while we were still on the bridge quite soon after. And I didn't think it was necessary, to be honest, but he took the number, and it was very lucky actually, because my phone died quite soon after. Um, and often there's cases where in the immediate aftermath of terrorist incidents, you know, the phone lines are blocked, in case there's potential for a follow-up incident. Um, and so he was able to take her number actually, and he rang her, and I was able to speak to her on his mobile number, um, which I was, you know, incredibly lucky. I know I say that a lot, but it really is with this, because not to get into it too much, but about an hour after the attack, there were several journalists from less scrupulous, newspapers that took photos of me on the stretcher, covered in blood, and then sent these to my mum, and asked her, essentially just flat out asked her, is he alive? So in many ways, I'm incredibly lucky that that officer said, ring someone, because that could have been the first way she was finding out about it.
How did they know who your mother was?
Well, this is the thing. I never, to this day, I don't know how my name got out there, because there are other guys in my group who have managed to remain anonymous, who were sat right next to me, in the photos. So I don't know how my name got out there, but as soon as they knew my name, they're then on Facebook, and they're looking on Twitter, anyone with that last name, and God knows how many people got messages. But I know for about 3 days after the attack, I couldn't, and I don't even mean this figuratively, it's quite literally, I couldn't take my phone off charge, because it died, from the amount of messages I was getting from journalists around the world, emails, Facebook, Twitter, even phone numbers. It makes you wonder how they get their hands on them, but they do. Yeah, it was a lot to deal with.
Yeah. What was that like? Was that really overwhelming for you, or did you feel supported by that?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely overwhelming. There was a lot of I didn't necessarily feel supported by that, because I didn't necessarily feel at the time like I had anything to provide. The facts were the facts, and all I'd done, you had these journalists who were sort of messaging you on Facebook and things, saying, "Oh, you're so brave," and all this lot, and I couldn't fathom why they would say things like that when all I'd done had survived.
Yeah.
So it was a lot to deal with, and I think, quite frankly, as well, it was a lot to deal with, because at the same time, I had friends and family who were trying to ring me, or were trying to text me and get in contact and say, how are you? And I'd
Yeah.
have much rather taken a message from a friend or family member any day over a journalist.
Yeah.
And that's not to say, that it's all negative. I mean, I've done many interviews since then, and at the time, I felt I had to give an interview. Actually, in many ways, I felt I had to, um, because when you didn't give them a quote, they would report on it anyway. Um,
Oh my
and-
God.
oh yeah, they would report on it anyway, because they'd report on just what they knew of it. And there were many articles out there, that cited incorrect injuries and things like that, and to the point where I had friends who were texting me saying, with the link of the article attached, saying, glad to hear you've not been badly injured and all this. And obviously I was sat in a hospital bed, so I felt as if I had to set the record straight, which is why I eventually did do interviews, but that was about a month afterwards, and I think I certainly wouldn't have felt suitable doing any sort of public speaking, at least before a month after the attack.
So, in the aftermath of everything that happened, it took 2 years for you to recover. And I read that you moved home, which must have been really disrupting to your life, your university degree, and everything. What was that like?
It was difficult. I was entirely dependent. At a very basic level, um, I had to be taken to appointments and things. I needed assistance with everything in those immediate 6 months after the attack, which I think, it's perhaps the wrong phrase, but in many ways it was quite dehumanizing.
Mhm.
It was, really brought you down to earth, and made you appreciate things, appreciate what you have. Um, I was lucky enough in that you mentioned the 2 year, 2 years, sorry, afterwards, where I was in physio, and not all of that was intensive. The latter half I was able to do, for example, just on weekends, was able to carry on with my university work. So I made it work, but it wasn't easy by any means.
Yeah. And were the other young men who were with you, they weren't injured as badly, so they went right back to university? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were all quite insistent that we didn't want to, take a year out or anything like that. So we all actually went back to university. albeit, I missed quite a few months at the end of the year of teaching. And I think we took the exam at a rescheduled later date. But we all were insistent that we didn't want to, miss a year or a semester. But yes, they received treatment and they were able to get the train back that same day that the attack had happened. Which, again, we were all incredibly lucky to survive in the first place. Although I would just say as a sort of disclaimer that not everyone um, deals with these things in the same way. And for some of the lads, I know they've had a really difficult time when it comes to the psychological aspects and the mental health aspects, the impacts of an attack like this, in perhaps a way that I necessarily wasn't as badly affected because I was so predominantly focused on the physical recovery.
That's very interesting. And like at two people, five people, however many it was, can have the same experience. And
It is interesting, and I think it's something that there's not been enough research on, especially when it comes to actually like terrorism and sort of traumatic mass casualty incidents, especially on the scale that we see in the United States, for example, with school shootings and the like. It would be really interesting to see if there are any patterns observed, but I'm just going out on a whim here. It's certainly something that I don't feel qualified to investigate further, but it's definitely a gap, I think, that needs a lot more research.
yeah, and would that research be like focused on like the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder from it, um, the impacts of surviving this kind of attack?
Yeah, I think so, and I think there's a lot of things that affect people after an attack like this. Specifically an act of terrorism that people don't think about, until they've been affected. There's financial aspects, being out of work for an extended amount of time, potentially, forever, if someone's sustained a life-changing injury. And a whole range of other things, like, for example, physiotherapy. I couldn't access physiotherapy to the level that was required under the NHS. It was largely, there was a waiting list, and then it was non-contact physiotherapy where they'd give you a sheet of exercises and say, come back in a few weeks. And I knew that with the range of injuries I'd sustained, I needed, the right treatment at the right time, or it was going to get worse.
Mm.
Something that I was really conscious about, as someone at a young age. I didn't want this to be something that physically affected me for my entire life. And so I had to go for private physiotherapy. And again, that's the sort of thing that incurs financial difficulty when you can't work. You're already, for example, I had to carry on paying for my university apartment that I couldn't use because it was up 3 flights of stairs.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, you've got all these range of difficulties, and this is just my experience. There are hundreds of stories out there of people who experience similar things, and the financial is just one aspect of it. As you said, there's the psycho sort of therapeutic side of things, the physical injuries, and many other. For example, recognition. That's not something that a lot of people would pay attention to. But when we think historically in terms of, say, for example, wars and conflict, there will never be a war, so to speak, that isn't, commemorated in some way by the countries involved, in remembrance of those who were lost, those who were injured. If we are effectively in, what is termed a war on terror, there needs to be recognition for those who are affected by no fault of their own. And that's something that I think is also deeply impactful for a lot of people who are affected by terrorism, because it's something that, these are attacks primarily against the state, and you've been injured or killed as a representative of a state. That guy didn't go on that bridge and drive at us because we were, Travis Frame from Lancashire. It was indiscriminate targeting of what he saw as, British citizens or Westerners. And I think because you were targeted as something far bigger than yourself, there needs to be a recognition of that. In order to allow those people, not just for those of us who survived, but those who've lost loved ones, to feel that, that loss wasn't for nothing.
And do you feel that there has been for that attack?
Well, it was difficult for us because we for many years there wasn't a sort of commemorative service or anything like that for Westminster, and it was only 5 years on that we were able to, by our own efforts and by us organising it, get a commemoration in place, get a service where we could all come together, and actually get a plaque installed on the bridge as well. But that took us 5 years to get in place. I'm not saying that is, uniform the case across the board, but I know that it's a constant issue of how do we remember these attacks, and do so in and do right in the eyes and minds of those who are affected. It's interesting when you look at other countries as well. I mean, France, for example, France now has France and Spain actually, national days of remembrance, specifically for victims of terrorism, in a similar fashion to, say, Armistice Day, Remembrance Day in November. They have a separate day entirely for people affected by terrorism. And I think that's an interesting thing to look at. I think it's an interesting concept because you're not just talking about those people we've lost, you're also raising awareness, amongst everyone in society about these issues, about the fact that they can just affect any random Joe on the street. It can be any one of us, at any time. And I think by having some sort of remembrance day like France have achieved, would be quite a big step forward towards essentially empowering and amplifying the role that a lot of people, in the general public have, to help prevent attacks like this, to keep an eye out for, for radicalization and things like that.
Yeah. Have they gotten and have there been lessons learned in that sense? Because did they do anything, for example, with the London Bridge attacks?
Yeah, so I believe, this is the difficulty as well, because there's no national, body, or government, department that is responsible for victims of terrorism. It can often go down right to the most local of levels, and in Manchester, for example, and London Bridge, there are two, obviously in Manchester's case, but with London Bridge as well, two different council areas, to Westminster, the attack that I was involved in. And I know that in Southwark, near where the London Bridge attack happened, the church there, cathedral that's nearby, actually took a lead in organising the commemoration themselves. In Manchester, I believe it was the mayor that took a lead on organising that themselves. In Westminster, we didn't really have that lead in place, so it fell to us to do it. Which I wouldn't wish on anyone, because it's a lot of additional stress to be dealing with. The very least we can do for people who are affected by these attacks, is, some form of commemoration, to show that, their loved ones are remembered. And I think something like a plaque is a very minimal, and very least we can do for the loss they've sustained.
Yeah. For you, seeing all of the attacks that have happened afterwards, has that been at all triggering?
Yeah, I mean, it's never easy. I mean, there's that sort of, repeated, I don't know, trauma's probably the wrong phrase, but that repeated moment of seeing it on the news, of seeing, the news flash up and it's happened. I think for me, the one I was most affected by actually was Manchester, because, I'd been affected by an attack, but it was in London. It was somewhere far away from home, and then
Mm,
Manchester was on my doorstep, and it was the next one to happen after Westminster. So I think that very deeply, affected me, especially because it was so soon after the Westminster attack. Everyone you'd speak to would say, "Oh, well, it's okay because these attacks, they don't happen very often. You don't need to worry." And then we had 5 in the same year, so it was definitely a difficult year.
yeah.
And I think not just for, perhaps even more so for those of us who've been affected by these attacks, but for everyone as well. It felt like, in that year in 2017, it was one after another, and it was non-stop, and that, I think, in many ways we have to, we have to think about the sort of wider psychological effect that might have on society itself.
Mhm,
Make people afraid. And I
mhm.
think we're just lucky, not just lucky, there are a lot of people who are working very hard to prevent these things, but for lack of a better phrase, lucky that many more attacks haven't happened since then.
Yeah, I was thinking this before our interview. It's interesting what you said, the effects, the psychological effects on society. The reason I actually wanted to interview you, this topic specifically, was because I was working in the Square Mile, so on London Bridge,
Mhm.
during the attack a few years ago. And I had been going out for a run, and I'll never forget, it was a gorgeous day in London, and I had my headphones in. I was running on my lunch break listening to I'm Every Woman. I was like, oh my God, life's amazing. I'm every woman. Literally, like,
Yeah,
get back. The moment I got back into the building, the doors are being shut, people are rushing by. And I'm like, what's going on? And we go upstairs and we can see something's happening on the bridge.
of
People are
course, yeah.
banging to get in.
Mhm.
And I remember for 2 days straight, like because we saw the body of the terrorist had been killed and his body was on the bridge, but no one knew that that was the terrorist. We were like, oh my God,
Of
is
course not.
is
No,
that
no.
someone who's just died?
Yeah.
And I remember for 2 days after that, just being like, I was just shaking and just it impacted me so much. It really damaged my feeling of safety.
And
Um,
I think that is the difficulty, isn't it, with these attacks? Because we have, I think, an inbuilt sense of security, especially at a young age. You think you're invincible, and I don't know why that is, but you just do. And when something like this, when any violent crime happens, but again, I do think it's almost exacerbated in an act of terrorism because of all the headlines it generates, and the fact that you can't escape it. It's on the TV, it's on your phone, it's everywhere, it's on Twitter. um, in many ways it shatters that sense of safety that you have. Makes you really sort of worry, and you don't have to put a label on that, because I don't think you can sort of diagnose that for many people, but there will be so many people who are in the periphery of these attacks, not just present in the area, like yourself, but also people who, well, I mean, let's say for example, if I had died, my family members are people that knew me back in Dorwin, where I'm from in Lancashire. Even the fact that someone from such a small town in Lancashire had been affected by an act of terrorism, now that was quite a shock to a lot of people, because it's quite a small, close-knit community, and it's just something that, again, unconsciously you assume doesn't affect people like us. Um, that sort of, even that at the low level, I think shatters that sense of safety. So, as you say, it is really, you know, concerning, I guess, in terms of long term, of how many people will be affected by these attacks, societal level.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, especially for me, I've you're just waiting for the other shoe to drop, like you were saying a moment ago, it's we haven't had one in a while, and I was thinking the same thing. I was like, I've been feeling so safe and I've been fine. I've been cycling everywhere. I've been getting the tube to London Bridge, but when I was preparing for this, I was like, I was reminded of that lack of security I felt, and I was thinking, oh, is it because it times marched on for so long? And then I panicked and was like, oh my God, when's the next one? Do they time these out? Like,
Yeah, of course,
how
yeah.
the heck does this, how does it happen? But do you feel like that your sense of safety has returned? Or did you feel like it was never taken away?
No, I mean, it was certainly taken away. I mean, I think there were a few other sort of, in many ways, reciprocating issues that took that sense of safety as well. I had, believe it or not, after the attack, I dealt with a lot of trolling actually on social media, from people who were claiming that the attack was fake, um, even to the point where I was receiving death threats and had to report these to the police. And
What?
that, yeah, I know, it's sounds remarkable, but when you look at, again, when you look at things like school shootings in America, and you see outspoken commentators questioning whether they're real or not, it really does, again, you would think it never happens to you. And so the fact that I was receiving, things like death threats, whilst I was effectively incapacitated, I was on crutches and everything and unable to, to care for myself, I think further shattered that sense of safety. Um, I would say, as you've mentioned, I would say it has come back in many ways, but I think there's always a level of awareness that you keep. That's not necessarily a negative. Um, it's just different, if that makes sense. The reality is, with these attacks, that they're not going to go away anytime soon, and neither are the ideologies that people are, purporting to claim to commit these attacks.
Yeah.
And I have little doubt that had it not been for the efforts of thousands of people around the country, whether they be activists or police officers, if it wasn't for their efforts day in day out, we'd probably be dealing with a lot more attacks than we are now. So I think we have to take stock of that and be proud and be happy of what we have, and then use that to sort of push us forward to carry on this work.
Yeah. And have you been back to London? Did you go back for the?
Yeah, I mean, remarkably, I've actually been back to London more since the attack than I ever had before. I mean, I said that I'm not, I hadn't visited London much before the attack, but I tend to be down there at least once a month these days.
It's been how many years now? So since 2017, and we're in 2022. How for you, do you feel like your life is back on track? You said it took 2 years to recover. Do you feel like you don't think about it every day? How has it been now?
It certainly never goes away. It if you don't think about it on a daily basis, there's certainly several times a week. Before the attack, I had a real sort of passion for education, um, and now I find myself working increasingly actually in counterterrorism, and working around radicalization and issues like extremism. But I think in many ways, and for a while, that um, had let it change me. But that's not the case. I see that in a more positive light now. I see that as me finding something constructive, something positive from something so horrific. And I don't see that as a negative.
Yeah, definitely. Have you felt any like peace at all in a sense of, I'm sure there was like, what feelings did you feel towards like the attacker?
Mhm. Well, I get asked this a lot actually, and I think perhaps it's because the attacker actually died in the attack. There wasn't a sort of protracted trial afterwards. Never really had much sort of thought towards the perpetrator. I'm certainly not one for I hear a lot of talk of forgiveness and things like that, and for me, I never felt that I needed to forgive anyone because he'd done what he'd done, and all I could do was decide what I did because of that. And To be quite frank, I know it's a simple point to make, but a lot of the time, my mind and my thought was more on victims themselves. There wasn't always the right levels of support in place for them, and so I think because I've been so occupied with trying to improve sport for people who might be affected in future, I think I've you know by nature had less of an opinion towards the actual perpetrator themselves.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the final two questions, I ask this every time. Number one, what advice would you give to people who have survived terrorist attacks? And perhaps maybe you wanted to phrase it as speaking to your younger self when you were going through those 2 tough years.
Just to be kind to yourself. There's no rule book for this sort of thing. Um, no amount of experts or academics will ever be able to write a rule book for this sort of thing, because every attack, while similar to those that have come before and will come after it, is different and is unique in its own way, and is unique in the way that it affects you. Um, and I would just say to be understanding of the fact that, you know, things are going to get a lot worse before they're going to get better. And I think I felt a lot after the attack. I felt a lot of expectation, to be one way, or to act one way, or speak one way. And I think a lot of that is because of the rhetoric we hear from politicians. Often there's a lot of talk of, we won't let them change us, we won't let terrorists change our way of life. Um, and I think the first step to not necessarily moving on, because that's the wrong phrase, but recovering from an act of terrorism, is to recognize that your life has changed. That might be depressing at first, but there's no way to get around that fact. You can't undo what has happened to you. At the end of the day, it's just what you do with that. And for me, I felt very much that I was at the start of my life, and I didn't want this to dominate the rest of my life. And I guess, as a sort of add-on, meet with other people who've been affected by terrorism. It might be a bit bizarre at first, but it really does help, because the more you speak to other people, it doesn't matter if they were affected by, say, a different ideology of attack, or they were affected by an attack in a different country, or even a different methodology of attack. Maybe they were affected by an attack 30 years ago. There's a lot of commonalities, and it helps. I think it helps to know that you're not just going through it alone.
That's really great. And if there's any support groups that you know of, perhaps I can put those in the show notes.
Sure, yeah, sure. I mean, there's one that I'm involved with, which less of a support group and more of a campaign group, and it's formed of a lot of us who feel we want to improve the support that's in place. It's called Survivors Against Terror. And as I should say as well, if there is anyone who has been affected by these issues and wants to get in touch, you're more than welcome to put them in touch.
Okay, thank you so much. And final question,
Mhm.
how can people who haven't been impacted support those who they know of who have?
Being an open ear where possible. I'm not saying that everyone will feel able or qualified to hear someone's story, or to hear their concerns after they've been affected by an attack like this. And the last thing we'd want is for someone to be traumatized by proxy, essentially, by hearing someone else's story. But I think being understanding of the fact that this person is going through something that, fortunately, very few people will ever be able to sympathize with, in the terms of knowing what they're going through, such as the nature of terrorism, that it does affect a small fraction of society. But for those it does affect, the impact on their life can be entirely life changing, and can alter that course entirely. So I think being understanding, being there, and just being available, when and if that person wants to talk. They may not want to. They may just want to know that they're in the presence of friends, and they're, for lack of a better phrase, they're safe.
That's so great. Thank you so much for that, Travis. And thank you for making the time to come on. I think this will help a lot of people out there to gain the understanding of what it's like, because you said it is a small fraction. So to hear your story is so powerful. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on.
Cool. Okay. Thanks so much. Bye.
Excellent. Have a good night. Bye bye.